Hi. The first sentence of this video is a lie. Did I just tell you the truth? I mean, I just told you that I was lying. If the first sentence of this video is a lie is false, then the first sentence of this video is true. I was lying to you. But if I told you that I was lying and I was telling you the truth, then the first sentence of this video is false. So if it's true, then it's false, but if it states that it's false and it is false, then it must be true. Huh. Bit of a headache. Welcome to Buridan's Bridge. Jean Buridan was a French priest and one of the most influential philosophers of the late Middle Ages. Aside from revising Aristotle's theory of motion, he's probably best known for his version of the liar paradox, and it goes a little something like this. Socrates wants to cross a river and comes to a bridge guarded by Plato. Plato says, "Socrates, if in the first proposition which you utter you speak the truth, I will permit you to cross. But surely if you speak falsely, I shall throw you into the water." Socrates replies, "You will throw me into the water." 700 years later, philosophers still can't agree on an answer to that. As a matter of fact, they haven't even agreed on the answer to the very first liar paradox, spoken by Epimenides in 600 BC. And he didn't even mean it as a paradox. Dude was just talking about Zeus. 2,617 years. We still can't agree on an answer. When most people think of a paradox, I think they think of it as a kind of riddle, a deliberate logical helix posed as an argument to mislead whoever it was posed to, a game. But there is one massive, infinitely important distinction between a paradox and a riddle, one that Philetus of Kos understood. Philetus studied paradoxes so intensely, particularly the liar, that he actually stopped sleeping and starved to death. His epitaph read, "Philetus of Kos am I, 'twas the liar who made me die, and the bad nights caused thereby." Now, you could say maybe dude took it a little too seriously, but Philetus understood that the true difference between a paradox and a riddle is that riddles can't hurt us. Paradoxes can, because humanity is a paradox. Every cornerstone of our existence, the reasons we create the things we do, the reasons wars begin and end, the reasons intellectual revolutions are sparked and stifled, all share their foundations in the paradox. Philetus got what a lot of people still don't. Humanity doesn't make sense, and it's scary as hell. And I don't think any director understood this better than the boy wonder himself, Kubrick. Nor do I think any film illustrates this better than his 1964 masterpiece, Dr. Strangelove, a film about a paradox illustrating humanity as a paradox that exists itself as a paradox within film. A paradox within a paradox within a paradox.
Hey, it's like Inception! Do you get it?
Like I was saying, paradoxes are big scary because we're living in one, and I'm gonna spend the next however long I feel like talking cool about it. So put on your thinking caps and strap in. I'm really smart and this is Dr. Strangelove, or how I learned to stop worrying and love the paradox.
I guess you wonder where I've been. I searched to find the love within.
Alright, so I'm gonna get this out of the way from the jump. Dr. Strangelove is the best Kubrick film. I don't care if you disagree, I don't care if Ebert or Siskel or Kale disagree, Strangelove is the peak. Every film Kubrick has ever made addresses the paradoxical nature of humanity, but it's always with a microscope to one of its faults and one of its strengths. Wrath and compassion, empathy and callousness, the immense strength and constant buckling pressure of consciousness, autonomy versus the restriction of it. K. Breezy's done it all. But Strangelove sits dead center, tackling them all at once with broad, viciously clever strokes. On my big list of Brick's best flicks, it is sat comfortably at the top next to its younger brother Barry. It is the best. Not saying it's objective, just letting you know that's the energy I'm coming with. Anyways, before Kubrick started to film Lolita, the world stage was in the second act of its most terrifying performance yet, the Cold War. Kubrick, convinced like many others were that the world might truly end with a nuclear holocaust, began reading literature on the subject of nuclear warfare, particularly after the Berlin crisis of 1961 when the Cold War almost turned into a hot war. By the time they had wrapped production on Lolita, he had read over 50 books on the subject, most notably Herman Kahn's book titled On Thermonuclear War. Nearly every film Kubrick has done has evolved from a personal obsession with a subject and his pursuing literature based on it, and this was no exception. Except this time, the obsession was based in fear. At some point, I'm a little hazy on the date here, Kubrick was recommended Peter George's novel Red Alert by a friend of his at the Institute of Strategic Studies, and he loved it. Convinced that it would make for a perfect suspense thriller, Kubrick and James B. Harris copped the screen rights and began translating the bulk of the book into the first script for their doomsday drama, The Delicate Balance of Terror. Not long into the writing process, though, Kubrick began to realize just how paradoxical and grim the circumstances humanity had put itself in were, and how funny they were. Alright, I'm not gonna explain the entire Cold War to you, unless you want me to. But basically, humanity was at the edge of its seat with a big red button that said Finn on it. And all the big boys from Stalin to Eisenhower to Kennedy to Castro to Khrushchev took turns hovering their shaky hands over it. A good example of the sheer level of paradoxical clown world shit humanity reached in the 60s is the US and NATO's stated foreign policy during the Cold War, called massive retaliation. In short, if any conventional military movement was detected against the West, not nukes, but just like normal soldiers, the US would start the end of the world. That was the actual, not joking, real public stance of the world powers at the time. Once Russia was able to respond to a nuclear attack, the US of A decided to kind of bargain 2-for-1 deal the massive retaliation thing I just mentioned with a snappy little paradox of a deterrence strategy called MAD, which stood for Mutually Assured Destruction. The basic idea being that if both the East and the West have enough nukes to completely destroy the other side, and that if attacked for any reason, the others would respond without fail with the totality of their force, the expected result would be an immediate, irreversible escalation of hostilities that would culminate in the destruction of the world powers, if not the world. To make this doctrine work, though, the US had to not let Russia think it was willing to risk a second strike. So naturally, they refused to build fallout shelters for their citizens. Ever wonder why a lot of European countries have big fucking bomb shelters and the closest thing we ever got to that was some alt history role-playing games? That's why. Literally gambling the entire population of the country on I bet you think we're scared. Well, we're not. Which doesn't even make sense because Kennedy ran on lying about Russia having superior nuclear power to garner fear and justify military funding while insulting the Eisenhower administration's lack of commitment to nuking commies, when in reality, the US peaked at like a 17-to-1 warhead ratio in our favor. And you know what the goofiest part of all that shit is? It worked, and it still works. Humanity does not make sense. Anyways, you can see how it was impossible, even for a master of drama and suspense like Kubrick, to honestly present the reality of the situation with a straight face. So he decided not to. Thinking of who could help him co-write a comedy screenplay about the end of the world, only one name came to his mind: Terry Southern. During the filming of Lolita, Peter Sellers had given Kubrick a copy of Southern's satire comedy, The Magic Christian, and Kubrick adored it. Southern flew to Shepperton Studios not long after, and what followed was one of the most biting and iconic satirical scripts ever written. Which begs the question, how do you create a comedy about nuclear devastation? Especially when you've never made a comedy before. I mean, Kubrick isn't exactly Mel Brooks. Dr. Strangelove is the only comedy in his filmography. So, how do you make it play funny? Kubrick's brilliantly simplistic answer to that question was don't try to make a comedy. Which brings us to our second paradox. That is to say, the first paradox is the film's subject matter, the paradox of nuclear deterrence. The second is the film itself. Strangelove doesn't make sense. I don't mean narratively, but I mean structurally. It is a comedy that is not written, performed, lit, edited, shot, or scored like a comedy. To allow for the proper depth of shadows while filming on black and white, Kubrick had to forego soft lighting completely in favor of extremely hard and dramatic lighting. Think, Carol Reed's The Third Man, or Billy Wilder's Sunset Boulevard. Super hard lighting. Characters feel like they're emerging out of the shadows when they come into the foreground. They lit a comedy like they were shooting a noir. So whatever exuberant atmosphere or tone you could hope to create for a comedy immediately went out the window. Kubrick also opted to shoot exclusively with ultra-wide lenses. And I mean ultra-wide. 50mm lenses most closely resemble the focal length of the human eye. Ozu used these oftentimes for an entire film because he liked to give a very human feeling to his shots. Strangelove, on the other hand, was shot almost entirely in 14.5mm, with a bit of 28mm thrown in as well. Not only does this offer an incredibly wide view of the film's characters and the absolutely cavernous set that Ken Adams designed for them, it also gives the impression that no one in specific is ever in focus. With the exception of a few extreme close-ups during dramatic peaks, the objects in Dr. Strangelove get more individual focus than the characters do. And that's kind of the opposite of how directors usually execute comedy. What I mean by that is, alright, so here's a scene from Greg Mottola's Superbad. Check this out.
Not gonna stop until you stop. Stop it! Stop it, asshole!
Hey, you stop! Fuck you, Evan! Touch me!
Why did you do that?
You shot a light in my face.
You shot a light in my face.
I'm driving.
Well, we were playing lightsabers, excuse me.
Oh my god. You guys make sure he's okay. Okay? Go out there and check on him.
You go out there
and check on him.
Fuck that, you go.
Notice how we have no choice but to look at what's funny here? Cops are being childish and fighting. We can't see McLovin or almost any of the car's interior because right now that's not funny. We see elbows and up on these two characters specifically because they're the goof and the audience needs to know it. Cut to an exterior shot to remind us that they're still driving a car, but the shot is so tight the only thing we're able to focus on are still the two characters. They're still the goof. Cut again for the sake of continuity to remind us that the two protagonists have been arguing this whole time, and then we immediately get two cuts on action, two reaction shots, and then another cut on action. Cut to super shallow focused Michael Cera playing his classic deer in the headlights what's new. Cut to a shot of the alcohol they just worked for like an hour of the film's runtime to obtain flowing onto the street. Cut to each of the silly cops because they're still silly, and then the final two cuts to remind us that McLovin, the dynamic duo's begrudged and possibly autistic companion, has been in the back seat the whole time. Why are we only seeing him in focus now? Because now it's funny to see him. He's only in the previous shot out of necessity, and while he's in frame, he's out of focus. Seth Rogen lightsaber cop is the big yuck here. Please look at Seth Rogen lightsaber cop. But in this shot, Mottola wants us to pay attention to him. McLovin is the crescendo. Now let's look at one of the comedic peaks in Strangelove.
Try BA-6543 Moscow.
Yes, sir.
You would never have found him through his office, Mr. President. Our premier is a man of the people, but he is also a man, if you follow my meaning.
What did you say?
I said Premier Kissoff is a degenerate atheist.
Mr. President, I formally request that you have this ignorant...
I'm sorry,
Mr. President, I think they're trying the number.
You filthy bully, you filthy... You silly guy, you autistic about him before, eh? You war muttering boy.
Gentlemen, you can't fight in here. This is the war room. What is going on here? I demand an explanation.
This clumsy fool tried to plant that ridiculous camera on me.
Yeah, you bet your sweets, Mr. Commie. Look at this, Mr. President. This lousy commie rat was taking pictures with this thing of the big board.
This shot starts with the camera panning along with the Russian ambassador Alexei into the middle of the war room. It's already been established that there's tension between Turgidson and Alexei, but neither is center frame and neither is isolated as the only character in the frame since the beginning of the shot. Once Turgidson does fall into center stage, he immediately turns his back to us and Alexei begins dialogue with the president on the opposite side of the frame. Now, we aren't sure who to look at. Nothing is the focal point, so everything becomes the focal point. Turgidson mumbles an insult about Dmitri, the Russian premier, but even when Alexei confronts him about it and they start to argue, they're still sharing the frame with the president. And all three are talking over one another, perpetuating this atmosphere of nothing in particular being something we should focus on. Camera pans away from Alexei and Turgidson as the president is called over to answer the phone, and only then do they start fighting. We can hear them struggling, but the only visual information we're being given is the president turning around to look at them, with 11 other characters. Even though narratively we're drawn to the president at the end of the shot, he's reacting the same way everyone else is. Visually, nothing is done here to pull our focus to him, and he stays to the far right of the frame until Kubrick cuts. Cut to a shot of Turgidson and Alexei struggling, the camera first panning left and then dollying forward, once again arguing over one another so neither character can be taken as the focus of the shot. And finally, President Muffley enters frame right and utters the paradoxical, satirical zenith of the film.
Gentlemen, you can't fight in here. This is the war room.
And yet, we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 characters in frame. No extreme close-up or even close-up of the president when he says it, no close-up or medium shot of the characters reacting to it. Everyone plays it straight, including the camera. Even in the following shot of Turgidson clutching Alexei while he shows the president the spy camera, both characters in frame have very distinct facial expressions and reactions to the situation, and neither are occupying more than half the frame. If anything, the point of focus in this shot is the object, not the characters. This is actually a very common theme in this film. Like I said earlier, the objects the characters interact with have more extreme close-ups than the characters themselves. And even in other comedic apexes, like the following phone conversation President Muffley has with Dimitri, the shots rarely focus on just whatever character is delivering the funny line. Again, here, visually, neither character is in or out of focus, and neither occupy more than half the frame. Most of the comedy noises in the film, with the exception of a few, are not framed like they're supposed to be funny, or even of particular importance for that matter. This extends to the delivery of the lines as well. Every character plays it straight and reacts as if what they're saying and doing is completely rational, given the circumstances. Turgidson and Ripper are no exception to this. They fall on the more extreme side of the spectrum, sure, but every line is delivered like the characters genuinely mean it. Body language, facial expression, vocal inflection, everything. When you combine this with Kubrick's use of wide and full shots, sparing cuts, and extremely steady camera movement whenever we're away from the soldiers in the film, Strangelove feels natural. And the more naturally it's presented to us visually, the more absurd it becomes. After Ripper's announcement to his base, every shot featuring a soldier in Dr. Strangelove is filmed with Kubrick's Aeroflex 35-2, which was a handheld combat camera. This gives a sense that there are two separate states of being in the world Stanley is presenting us: those who are inside and those who are outside. Inside the war room, there might be sort of a calm panic, sure, but Muffley and Alexei and Turgidson and Strangelove and all the others are not the ones in immediate danger. The soldiers are. Those who are inside and those who are out. This is seen in the interior of the B-52 as well. Granted, this may have partially been due to the technical limitations of filming inside a cockpit suspended 15 feet off the ground since, no Steadicam, but this lack of composure in the camera's movements reflects the emotional turmoil within the characters in the shots. Kong and Ace and Zog and the others in the B-52 will be the first to go, and Kubrick lets us know before they know. The Burpleton airmen, as well as the soldiers storming the base, know they'll probably die. All of the steadiness and the smooth pans and the dolly shots, all of the glamour and composure of the inside is immediately stripped away when we're put into the shoes of the soldiers, when we're forced outside. And it all comes rushing back when we're back. In the war room or Ripper's office or the hallways of the base with Mandrake and Guano. The film pulls us between outward and inward chaos constantly. Convenient innuendo segue into another paradoxical theme of this film: sex. When you look back through history, there are two things humanity seems especially invested in. Those are sex and war. Whether it's Renaissance or neoclassical or neo-impressionism or Orientalism or German Romanticism, you can pick pretty much any art movement since we moved past painting on cave walls, and I can guarantee you that the most common imagery you'll find is warriors and nudity. This isn't limited to visual mediums either. Pretty much universally, every mythos and religion that has ever existed is firmly planted in fertility and war. Zeus is a good example, since I brought him up at the start of this video as indirectly being the source of the first liar paradox. Strongest god, top dog, big dog on the mountain, top god. Also a bisexual serial rapist with 92 children. Shiva, responsible for Kama Sutra, also known for their ability to destroy the universe by merely opening their eye. I think Odin had like 6 sons from 3 different wives, one of them being a giant. Horus had like 4. You get my point. Oftentimes, the source of war can be traced back to lust, and vice versa. Lust or sexual envy and inadequacy can drive a human's heart to commit atrocities it normally wouldn't. And the spoils of those atrocities oftentimes were sex. We see this mirrored in the opening credits of the film. A B-52 refueling sequence set to an airy orchestral rendition of Try a Little Tenderness, arranged by Laurie Johnson. This overtly sexual imagery, chosen specifically by title designer Pablo Ferro for its sensuality, perfectly encapsulates the inseparableness of sex and war. Flying fortresses of death, carrying the most mortiferous, evil weapons man has ever created. And yet, there's something elegant and graceful and disarming about them. Kubrick and Ferro usher us into the film using this mechanical copulation as our first metaphor for the paradoxical nature of humanity. And it works beautifully. And more than beautiful, it's consistent. This theme is maintained throughout the entirety of the film. Sexual inadequacy is Jack the Ripper's sole motivation for his preemptive strike against the Russians, convinced that the communists were contaminating America's water supply with fluoride and that this was the reason he wasn't able to stay hard. Buck Turgidsen's childlike approach to and enthrallment with Tracy Reed's character Miss Scott, the Playboy prints that plaster the inside of the bomb crew's lockers, Major Kong riding a nuclear warhead to his death, gripping onto it like its earth-rending potential is at the same time an extension of his manhood. Strangelove, describing the logistics of the elite's mineshaft harems as the world is seconds from ending. The end of all humanity and human history as we know it, indirectly ushered in by the source of all life. I mentioned the scoring of the film briefly there, and I think it's an opportune time to bring up why it too is a deliberately paradoxical aspect of this film. I just explained what the intro scoring is, but there are actually only 2 other pieces of music in the entire length of this film. Roughly an hour of its runtime features no scoring whatsoever. Actually, no, correcting myself here, you could make the argument that there are 4 pieces of music in this film. I am now going to make that argument. So, the second piece of music we hear is about 10 minutes into the film, when Major Kong is given the go code and puts on his cowboy hat. The melody playing here, also arranged by Laurie Johnson, is probably pretty recognizable if you live in the West, or consume pretty much any Western media at all, ever. It's the 19th century American folk song, When Johnny Comes Marching Home. Or is it? See, there's another 19th century war song sung to the same melody, known as Johnny I Hardly Knew Ye. Here's the issue, though. The arrangement that's playing in every scene featuring Major Kong and his bomber team following this one until the end of the film doesn't feature lyrics. It's only the instrumental. But the songs have completely contradictory meanings. When Johnny Comes Marching Home was originally written by Patrick Gilmore during the American Civil War for his sister Annie to sing as she prayed for the safe return of her fiancé. It's a pro-war song about a town being elated with the return of their soldier to hear his stories of victory, lauding him as a hero. Whereas Johnny I Hardly Knew Ye is a staunchly anti-war ballad of an Irish woman who meets her former lover that had abandoned her with their illegitimate child to go to war. She finds him permanently and irreparably damaged by the war, having lost his legs, his arms, and his eyes in the fighting. She takes pity on him and welcomes him back as her lover, but the damage has already been done. So, which one is it? Is it pro-war or is it anti-war? Is the music rooting for the bombing team, or is the music, and by extension, the audience, condemning them and their folly? The answer, you guessed it, is a bit of a paradox. About an hour and 25 minutes into the film, we first get to see the yield the B-52 has been carrying, in this shot of Major Kong trying to manually repair the bay doors. Notice the twin warheads and what is written on each of them. Hi there, and Dear John. When Johnny Comes Marching Home. The left warhead is the elated greeting that follows the end of the song, welcoming soldiers back home for a job well done. Appropriately, this is the warhead Major Kong famously plummets to his death on. The warhead on the right, however, is a letter to John, Johnny I Hardly Knew Ye, a condemnation of war out of pity for those who suffer through it, from the perspective of those who war leaves behind. Both of the songs are playing at the same time. This is where the outside and the inside meet. Notice the shift in stability of the camera here. Panic, 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 calm. Only in the meridian of the bomber team's arc, the crest of their half of the narrative, do any of their members feel at peace. And it's Kong, right before his death. The outside and the inside. If I ever had to condense the sentiment of those anti-war, pro-troop sort of bumper stickers you see every so often into a single marriage of vision and sound, say 30 seconds in length, this would be it. This moment and the one following it. Two songs which completely juxtapose one another, arranged to the same melody, weaving themselves into a double helix of contradiction and pride and empathy and condemnation. And then they stop. Finally, this brings me to the ending. Vera Lynn's rendition of We'll Meet Again, with backing vocals from the sailors, soldiers, and airmen of Her Majesty's forces. One of the most iconic musical conclusions to any piece of cinema ever. Better than Simple Minds at the end of The Breakfast Club, better than Gary Jules at the end of Donnie Darko, maybe not better than John Williams' ending score for E.T., but close. Really, 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 really close. What makes the ending of this film so special is that it's the first time Kubrick shows any kind of optimism or hope in the film. I don't mean from characters or the lines they deliver. There's actually quite a bit of blind optimism in this film. But I mean in the way the film is presented to us. This is the solitary moment of genuine hopefulness. Dr. Strangelove bellowing out that he can walk, immediately followed by the assumed end of all human life on Earth. This is the only point of perceptible, believable optimism in the film. Let me explain why. Every point in Dr. Strangelove where a character expresses optimism, there runs a very important, very noticeable through line that Kubrick and co. diligently placed in just the right spots to ensure that we never believe a word of it. That is, every time a character expresses optimism in this film, they're lying, either to us or to themselves. The camera work or the lighting or both shows us that it's either malicious or self-deceptive. We either know they're lying to themselves and feel pity for them, or we know their ideal is one without empathy, but one we don't have a choice but to go with. They know their efforts are pointless, their brain is just doing a miraculous job of trying to hide it from them. Or it's not actually a desirable outcome, it's just the only one that they will allow us to have. Probably the best example of this is Jack D. Ripper explaining why he issued and refuses to recall Wing Attack Plan R to Group Captain Mandrake. The moment Mandrake realizes the only way out and the only way to stop the attack is through Ripper, he is at his smallest and least significant that we see him in the film, while Ripper is at his largest. Ripper sits with complete composure in the shadow cast over him by the hard lighting of his overhanging desk lamp, while Mandrake, meek and afraid, stands illuminated at the opposite end of the room, dwarfed by the upper torso of a man he is now convinced needs to be taken out of power. Without being told directly, the audience is given the outcome of this exchange before it happens. After Mandrake approaches and demands Ripper step down from power and hand him the recall code, Kubrick cuts to an extreme low-angle close-up of Ripper, the hard lighting from before casting shadows down his face, like a titanic statue looming over us. We don't even need to see the gun on his desk that Kubrick cuts to after holding the shot for a few seconds. This shot alone, without Ripper saying a word, renders Mandrake and the audience powerless. And this is where the voice of maleficent optimism rings in. Ripper, as he explains why attacking the Russians without consent or approval or cooperation from the rest of the government or military is somehow the right and good thing to do. The angle and lighting of the shot punctuating every word with a simple message. This is not hope. This is the world being held hostage. Sure, it technically fits within the descriptive boundaries of optimism, but Kubrick keeps repeating to the audience that it's dangerous for us to believe a word of it. Jack D. Ripper is our paranoid captor. Compare this to one of the delusional optimists of the film, Major Kong. Once he grasped that for them to receive the go code, most, if not all, of his friends and family and country were swallowed by nuclear hellfire, he switches into what I like to call phantasm mode. Basically, when you reach a state of despair or panic so great that your brain doesn't know how to handle it properly, and following its prime directive of not letting you die or let your consciousness collapse in on itself creates the illusion of a light at the end of the tunnel. one that it refuses to let you acknowledge isn't actually there. This is the best way I can think of to describe Kong, justifying their use of nuclear warheads against the Russians and then following it up by saying he and his bomber team will be in line for medals and awards when they get home. A home he just told them was gone. It's mental gymnastics at their finest, and up until about the last 2 minutes, these are our only other tastes of optimism in the film. Malice and self-delusion. Everything everyone ever says in the film shares a doom. One that we're made aware of by the way Kubrick structures and presents the information to us. Until right here. Just this last little stretch of runtime. Turgidson just ruined whatever chance of post-apocalyptic diplomacy the Cave Americans and the Cave Soviets could have had. Muffley and the others are still distracted with the fantasy of 10-to-1 waifu ratios for their cave harems, and the closest thing we had to a team of protagonists are dead, or will be very soon. Everything shapes up to be the perfect, self-damning end to a tale of the hubris of man, in all our boundless expertise in making life hell for ourselves. But then, something happens. Strangelove, drawing all of the attention in the room to him, stands up. The quietly calamitous Dr. Doom that has spent most of the film in the shadows is finally freed from his imprisonment. And for whatever reason, we feel kind of happy for him. There's nothing to snark at or criticize after Turgidson's brainless ramblings about a mineshaft gap are interrupted. A genuinely evil man who moments ago was discussing cave eugenics as a net positive for humanity, while most humans are about to be wiped off the face of the planet, can walk. And he expresses joy. He's hopeful, he's exhilarated, and it's genuine. Kubrick pulls the through line out from under us like a ripcord, and for these few seconds, we're experiencing joy. After 2 steps, the nukes drop. And the end of man is ushered in with joy and warmth. And I don't mean heat from the bombs either. We'll Meet Again, particularly this rendition, is like a wave of comfort and revelry that washes over you and compounds this brief feeling of joy we just experienced for the first time in an hour and 32 minutes. There were laughs, sure, but they were bitter and fearful. Remember, this film came out when this was all still plausible. Every subject of comedy in Strangelove is just the genuine fears of humanity at the time, being pulled out of the dark to laugh in the face of because they're too absurd to respond to with anything else. And no better song could play us off of it. We'll Meet Again is from Philip Brandon's 1943 musical bearing the same name. It's about a young singer rising to stardom in the height of World War II. The plot of the musical itself isn't particularly important, but it is important to understand its cultural relevance as a propaganda vehicle. Like many other propaganda vehicle films, its lead song became a hit for the war effort. We'll Meet Again was sung from the streets and from the windows and the balconies to soldiers departing for war against the Axis, and became so resonant with the British armed forces and their families that in the height of the Cold War, it was included in the package of songs and programs held by the BBC to be played from radio broadcasting bunkers designed to provide public information and boost morale for at least 100 days after the nation suffered a nuclear attack. It was chosen as one of humanity's security blankets. More than comforting, it's optimistic. When you look at the lyrics of the song, it's the parting words someone would speak, hoping beyond hope that their time apart from you is only temporary. A tender reminder to keep your hopes and your ambitions about you, no matter how much the clouds might darken. The other 2 uses of music in the film are paradoxical in their nature, but in a wholly different way. Try a Little Tenderness playfully digs at the trope of sex and war being inseparable fixations of man, and the double feature of When Johnny Comes Marching Home and Johnny I Hardly Knew Ye express the juxtaposed but nonetheless intertwined sentiments of hating war and loving those who serve in it. But Kubrick ends his black comedy satirizing the very real sword of Damocles hanging over humanity's shoulders by simply playing for us words of comfort and compassion and hope. And this is just a hunch, but I think he needed to hear them, too. I mean, this entire film is born out of his conviction that we might not exist soon. Just waiting under the sword for something. And that sword never left. If anything, it just got bigger, but the grip tightened. Any minute of any day of any year, someone could usher in the end of the world. That's what makes Dr. Strangelove's ending so poignant, and at the same time, comforting. Kubrick's 2-minute love letter to humanity at the precipice of extinction that somehow, some way, despite the almost paralyzing fear and absurdity that we're forced to hang in the balance of every day, will be all right. Humanity should not have logically existed for as long as we have. It doesn't make sense. Zeno and Philetus and Chrysippus and Kant and Confucius and Hume and Berkeley and Al-Ghazali and Rond and Sue and Hobbes and Hippo and Montesquieu and every other great mind from the beginning of humanity to right now still can't agree on how or why we are the way we are. Somehow, despite endless hurdles of self-imposed destruction through war and segregation and racism, religious and political zealotry and xenophobia and disease and drought and fire and floods and nuclear fission turn onto our own in the peak of our desperation, we keep growing. From anguish and sorrow and pain, we capture beauty and ecstasy, and from our fears, comedy. We create great big things and help those suffering and those who cannot fend for themselves despite every bit of rational thought standing firmly against it. We are hardwired for combat and self-preservation, but at the same time, our resting pulse is nurturing others and putting the needs of whoever or whatever we care about above our own selfish ends. Strangelove is in a constant balancing act between two completely opposing lines of thought that are constantly at war with each other, just like humanity. And yet somehow, we're still here. Somehow, we'll be okay. The paradox.
Won't you tell him, please, to put on some speed?
Hey, thanks for watching my my video here. I appreciate it. Mwah. That's for you. Bullet points. Got another cool vid here. Click that if you like this. Subscribe, please. Let me know what you thought about what I thought down below. And Patreon. If you feel like helping support the channel and helping me make more slick vids like the one you just watched, consider becoming a patron. Every little bit helps me make this thing a full-time gig. All right, love you. Have a good night.